So yes, I have a YouTube page, and those of you who are in my English 201 class this semester, I welcome you to go and look at videos from previous semesters. If the titles of them interest you, by no means do you have to. I will say you might be a bit confused this semester, since videos I post will have very similar titles to videos I posted last semester. And that's because I taught the same course last semester. Or I should say I taught a course with the same title, English 201 Principles of Literary Study. The content of these two courses are very different. We're using completely different books, and it will be a much different approach, as I think these videos will bear out, than the one I took last semester. Okay, and maybe I'll talk a bit more about that in class, or even in these videos as I move along, since they are something of an experiment for me too. So in class, I let you all go early on accident. I thought we were done at 10:15, which didn't make any sense. You could tell maybe I was just a bit too tired this morning. For those of you who were happy, I let you go half an hour early. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it won't happen again. I will keep you all the way up to 10:45 next time, especially since we'll have so much to discuss. But because I felt rushed, I don't think I really gave the introduction to the course that I really wanted to give. And one of the ways in which I wanted to introduce the course was to reflect on its title, Principles of Literary Study. A principle, after all, is an idea that forms the basis of something, whether that something be simply a thing, a discipline, or a theory, right? And so I thought I might reflect on three key differences that relate to this idea of principles. Three key differences between principles of literary study and, let's say, the principles of scientific investigation. Okay, and those three ways pertain to how texts or textbooks are treated, or how they are arranged or approached in literary study versus scientific investigation. Two, what sort of relationship to the past one is cultivating in scientific investigation versus literary study. And keep in mind, I'm saying this as someone who is a lay person in science, right? So in some sense, I'll probably be comparing literary study to something of a gross caricaturization of scientific investigation. So for any scientists watching this, I apologize. It's really just to try to draw out the particularities of literary study that I'm doing this. So textbooks, relationship to the past, and lastly, the formulation of the object of study itself. So these are the differences between literary study and scientific study that I want to talk about in this lecture, specifically how they pertain to the idea of principles. Okay, the principles of literary study. That is, the sorts of ideas that form the basis or the ground of something, whether that something be a truth or a field or a theory. Okay, so I begin. The principles of other disciplines tend to be presented to first-year students by their introductory textbooks as more systematic and coherent than those that support literary studies. And I use the word support here, note the scare quotes, with intended irony. Okay, I'll explain why in a few minutes. Though textbooks in other disciplines certainly change apropos new discoveries or theories, their structure and purpose remain largely the same. To give students a solid and coherent conceptual foundation upon which to build up a specialization, whether it be in communications or business or biology or psychology. In order to pass these classes, right, these introductory courses, one memorizes the definitions of terms, the visual arrangements and patterns of diagrams, the step-by-step summaries of processes, and the parameters according to which one studies, predicts, and or tests the properties or behaviors of certain objects or phenomena. Since the consequences and implications of new discoveries become part of each renewed version of introductory textbooks, students studying, let's say, physics in 2014 tend to know more about the universe and how it works than top researchers did 100 years ago. This would be a mundane fact to scientists, but in the humanities, this can sometimes feel somewhat surprising. And I'll say why in just a second. Partly because this affects how we think about the relationship of students of science to the past. This approach to teaching physics or biology or psychology in introductory courses gives students and scholars a relationship to the past that is not predicated upon the habit of sifting, as one sees in the humanities, through oeuvres of its founders or significant figures. I will never forget my surprise, though I should not have been surprised, at hearing prominent astrophysicist Steven Weinberg assert the following in a talk he gave in 2006, and would later extend and publish in the New York Review of Books in 2008. And I'm quoting him here. "In my field, Einstein is the greatest hero of the 20th century. But no one today, arguing about the theory of gravitation, would settle the issue by referring back to Einstein's papers of 1915-1916. Today, it's understood that any reasonably good graduate student understands general relativity better than Einstein did. We have learned. We have progressed." In a lecture that's even earlier than that one, I think, it might be later than that one, and I'll post links to these in the descriptions below so you can hear him for yourself. His wording is even more extreme than this, saying, sort of exclaiming, no one reads Einstein anymore, right? No one except someone who's interested in the history of science, right, would even bother to go and read his papers in order to learn anything about general relativity, let's say. Okay. So what do we make of Weinberg's thoughts on Einstein? Right, a hero, but also not someone that one goes back to solve disputes anymore. Okay. This is all to say that because the principles of physics change and grow, the foundation of the study of physics, meaning its principles, are not and should not be found in the life and work of thinkers who form some sort of scientific canon of writers. Okay? One does not need to study the writings of Einstein in order to become a great physicist. One need not even study the writings of Darwin in order to become a great biologist. The ideas and theories that give disciplines like physics or biology a basis or foundation, ideas that continue to be empirically tested and verified, that continue to help us make predictions, that have opened up other questions, problems, and ideas, can be divorced from their initial authors. Their ideas can be pre-digested for students and arranged in rhetorically sophisticated and effective syntheses of standard terms, definitions, and models, which we call textbooks, and which will follow students through their coursework, and even should they aspire to do so, into graduate and professional research. As for ideas that have not survived, that have failed tests of verifications, that are no longer useful for making predictions, that imply a misleading or incorrect model of the universe, or a disputed or falsified model of the universe, these can be left behind without any harm being done to the discipline, or to the introductory teaching that continues to enable the discipline to thrive. Okay. So part 3 about scientific investigation pertains to objects of study. The strategies of introductory textbooks in entry-level biology or physics or communications courses, and the orientation to the past that such strategies cultivate, offer students and scholars a freedom from ready-made dogmatisms that claim to know how the world works without evidence or experiment or verifiability, or why it is here, or what we should do about it. But it also offers them, I would contend, certainty and agreement, at least within the field, about what the object or objects of study actually are. In fact, in one of the videos that I'll be linking you to, Weinberg sort of outright says this, right? That studying cosmology in the US is no different than studying cosmology anywhere else in the world, right? It's the same, right? Everybody is clear about the object of study. There may be tensions between theorists and experimentalists. We see this sort of in comedic form in a show like The Big Bang Theory, right? There may be competitions between researchers, but students are rarely confused about what they are studying or what they are gaining knowledge of in their introductory textbooks. When I studied cellular biology as an undergraduate, I understood that I was learning about the elements and features of various cell structures. Right? I was never confused about that. The difficulty was, could I remember all the names and all the functions and where they were in the diagrams that I studied. When I studied interpersonal communication, I understood that I was learning about the element and features of meaning making between human conveyors and receivers of usually verbal information. Okay, so that's textbooks, relationship to the past, objects of study. So, but what about English classes? In the literature classroom, one's relationship to texts, the past, and objects of study are much different. Pertaining to textbooks, a novel published in 2014, let's say David Mitchell's The Bone Clocks, which came out just a few days ago in the US, it's been out in Britain, I think, for a while. Mitchell's The Bone Clocks is not an improvement upon a novel published in 1925, let's say Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, or a novel published serially between 1759 and 1767, Lawrence Sterne's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman. It is not an improvement, David Mitchell's novel, in the way an article on or a chapter on general relativity in a physics textbook probably improves upon the writings of Einstein. In many classrooms, novels and poems and plays, even the most ancient, are our textbooks. These are our texts. Okay. Though additions may be improved, though you may have a sort of textual apparatus surrounding those novels, plays, or poems that give you more information with which you can better understand them, the texts themselves are our textbooks. And that's often why literature professors rarely refer to the texts that students are studying as textbooks, right? Because they are not rhetorically structured the way that a textbook is structured in other courses, although there are, of course, English textbooks, right? Like the Norton Anthology of Literature, for instance, would be a textbook, and certainly we have a textbook too, the Bennett and Royal collaboration. Okay, but the point is, our relationship to the texts are much different, right? They're not pre-digested in some sense for us, right? And making even the simple task of note taking very difficult. What do you pay attention to? Where do you write something in the margin? What passage do you quote in a paper? What theme do you bring up in class, right? All of these are things you sort of have to figure out as you're reading the text, right? Which I'll come back to in just a second. Okay. How does this alter our relationship then to the past? Or what can we say about the student's relationship to the past? The literature students tend not to read much of, just pulling a name out of the air, Cleanth Brooks anymore. Cleanth Brooks was a prominent, I think he's dead. Cleanth, if you're still alive, I apologize. Anyway, was a prominent American literary theorist and critic of the middle decades of the 20th century. The reason students do not read him very much anymore has little to do with the reasons physics students might never read Einstein in a physics course. Literature students probably don't read much Brooks not because they know more than he does, or because there are more straightforward ways to understand his insights. Rather, they do not read him because there is just so much to read. Sometimes it feels like there's too much to read. Because the principles of literary study are nothing less than the terms, concepts, ideas, and theoretical models developed throughout a whole history of criticism and theory, which extends from the pre-Socratics of ancient Greeks to the contemporary writings of Franco Moretti, Judith Butler, and Paul Gilroy. Because of this, right? Because the whole history, in some sense, always still matters to us, right? Sometimes we don't have time to go back and read those texts. But then again, there are authors that have a staying power much greater than Cleanth Brooks. Okay, so while he might fall off the shelf for reasons much different than Einstein falls off the shelf, there are figures like Sigmund Freud, for instance, who we continue to read passionately, vehemently, sometimes antagonistically, right? Even though in the field of psychology, many of his ideas, or neuroscience, many of his ideas have been debunked, there is nevertheless, within English studies specifically, a fascination with his writing. An insistence that there's still something to learn here, even if that something is not the kind of thing that scientists, for instance, may be interested in, or psychologists, although I'm sure they would be. Okay. Very rarely do you encounter a professor or a student of literature who claims that reading Plato, for instance, is a waste of time, or that one should not bother with the preface to the lyrical ballads, or that one can do without some notion of the intentional fallacy, or that one need not even consider the avenues opened by deconstruction, cultural and or materialist historians, anthropologists, and or feminist, queer, or race theorists / critics. Individual scholars may harbor such beliefs, indeed their research may set out to discredit specific concepts or theorists like Michel Foucault or Jacques Derrida, but it would still largely be seen as unfavorable for teachers to dismiss in its entirety the history of theory and criticism and literature's relationship to it. This is not to say that literary studies is without foundation, but rather that it sets its foundation in shifting sands. One can see this as one is supposed to see it in Christ's famous parable as foolhardy, risky, or irresponsible. In fact, many scholars outside of the humanities have this very view of literary studies, or one can see it as exciting, as I said in class, empowering, or transformative. But saying this, we run into a big problem that pertains to the object of study in our classrooms, or specifically in this classroom. In identifying novels, poems, and plays as our primary texts and textbooks, we may be left asking the following questions. What are we doing, right? What are we studying when we study literature? What in particular is the object of our study? What is the object that we are purporting to gain knowledge of or from? The first chapter of our textbook, our actual textbook, Bennett and Royal, puts it another way. What constitutes the beginning of literary studies? When have we begun to study literature, right? And not just to enjoy it, let's say, okay? Although I certainly enjoy the study of literature. When we consider the text, the author, the reader, or context of one, two, or all three of these figures, have we really begun? It seems to me that these questions do not really haunt the sciences or science majors, though I'm not making a claim that these questions need to, just that I've noticed that they just don't tend to be bothered by these questions the way we are. Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, a theorist and critic who I mentioned in class today, claims when asked or when giving public addresses that she teaches, at the end of the day, what she teaches is reading. Reading is, according to Spivak, the object of study in her classrooms. She defines reading, right, not simply as glancing at words and recognizing their meaning, but as the active suspension of oneself in the text, life, or mind and body of the other, and thus bringing about the training of an ethical impulse to learn from that which is different from oneself, that which is befuddling, that which is even horrifying or repulsive, initially horrifying or repulsive. She also, that is Spivak, calls this sabotaging an older concept. She calls this aesthetic education. In a recent public lecture, which I'll also link to in the description, Spivak states, quote, what I really mean by aesthetic, I really mean by aesthetic education anything that trains the imagination for epistemological performance. Meaty phrase, epistemological performance. In other words, training the imagination for the construction of things to know. Not the discovery of things to know, but the construction, the building, right? The performing of the things to know. The problem of knowledge, she later says, is not what to know, but how to know them, how to know the things we want to know, and how to make them into things known. How do we know a work of literature? By understanding its plot, having a sense of its major themes, appreciating its characters? In part, a little bit, but I hope you sense that these are unsatisfactory answers. Most people with even a modicum of television addiction, like I have, can already do these things. They can follow narratives, right? They know what a character is. They can sense a theme at work. But critical and creative reading, I suggest, is the skill that one cultivates in studying literature in the college classroom. This critical and creative reading constitutes a set of practices and reflexes, trained reflexes, capable of attending closely and widely, slowly and quickly, with elegant and odd patterns, difficulties, uncertainties, and intuitions. To read is, in this sense, to know a thing through the failure of being able to see it all at once, and through that failure, to construct a problem that we wish to address in our efforts to know, to read, and to follow wherever it, that is, the problem, leads us. The principles of literary study, then, do not constitute solid terms or robust, verified theoretical models, such as like evolution or gravitation or something like that, but rather, the principles of literary studies constitute problems that beckon further problematization, a word I'll be coming back to in class. Problems that remain problems for reasons I hope will become clear throughout the semester. And I'll maybe say a bit more about this in a follow-up video, but the way our book arranges itself is very much around the investigation not of different methodologies, although it does talk about methods and the history of different approaches to the analysis of literature, but rather as a survey of different problems that remain problems. So that when you read the first chapter of Bennett and Royal on beginning, right, on the problem of beginning, by the time you reach the end of that chapter, the problem has not been solved. Right. In fact, I think the chapter might even end with questions, right? Or that questions make up a big chunk of its final paragraph, right? This is an important difference, perhaps, that marks literary study out as a somewhat troubling field of study, especially for those outside of it. That its principles are set, again, sort of sabotaging Christ's parable. Apologies to those who don't like that idea, or not really, but still, I don't want to be a jerk. Sabotaging that idea to construct our house in shifting sand, and not to see that as irresponsible or irresponsible, though it may be risky, but to see it as a way of thinking that is okay with one's house crumbling, because it means that we have a chance to build it up again, right? And I think over the course of the semester, we'll try to concretize that, anchor it in some actual reading of some actual literature. And as we move through our textbook, taking up and thinking through and turning around different problems like reading, like ideology, like God, like the postmodern, like war, like desire, like gender, that what you'll really be learning how to do is how to construct problems of your own, so that in a paper of your own, you can pursue a problem where it leads. And only then will you, I think, really be grounded on the sort of shifting principles of literary study. Okay. All right, so that went a little longer than I wanted it to. I may add one or two much shorter videos to this, talking about sort of nuts and bolts issues of the course itself. The choice of texts. I apologize if you keep hearing a buzzing sound. There's someone doing yard work outside. I'm going to rewatch this video and hopefully it isn't too distracting. But so anyway, I look forward to seeing you Tuesday. Remember to do the reading I posted on Sakai, chapters 1 through 4 of Bennett and Royals, and the selections from section 7, I think, of the Penguin Book of Romantic Poetry. Okay, have a great weekend.